It was late November 1944, when the first cold winds rolled across the plains of central Texas and down into the neat rows of wooden barracks behind barbed wire. The men inside had grown used to America's strange rhythm, the clatter of boots at dawn, the smell of boiled coffee drifting from the guardhouse, the faraway whistle of freight trains, but nothing prepared them for this morning. Private Franz Muller, once a soldier in Rommel's vaunted Africa Corps, pressed his face to the frosted window and frowned. Something drifted across the compound on the breeze, a scent so alien to prisoners of war that it seemed impossible. Roasted turkey, spices, fresh bread. He turned to the man on the bunk above him. "Reeks Dudas. Do you smell that?" The man laughed. "It's a trick. Americans fattening us before something worse." But Muller wasn't sure. The story of how these German soldiers came to be here, thousands of miles from home, begins 2 years earlier on the baking sands of Tunisia. In early 1943, as the Africa Corps collapsed under British and American pressure, tens of thousands of weary men surrendered. They had been promised reinforcements that never came, air cover that never appeared, and supply lines that crumbled under relentless Allied bombing. Those captured tankers, infantry, artillery crews, were marched to ports and loaded onto Liberty ships. They expected rough treatment. Nazi propaganda had warned them that Americans were half wild, that they hated Germans personally, that capture meant humiliation and starvation. Some men had been told the U.S. couldn't even feed its own army properly. The journey across the Atlantic was no pleasure cruise. Convoys zigzagged to avoid lurking U-boats blacked out at night, escorted by destroyers whose depth charges rumbled in the dark sea. Prisoners were confined below decks, crammed into holds fitted with rough bunks and wire mesh. Seasickness swept through them as cold spray leaked in through vents. Yet even then, the narrative they had been fed began to crack. Guards offered them blankets, extra water, even cigarettes. One POW later wrote that the first real surprise was when an American sailor handed him an orange. "I had not tasted one since the war began. We were supposed to be hated animals. Yet this man smiled and passed me fruit." After weeks at sea, the convoys reached the eastern seaboard. New York, Boston-ware prisoners stared wide-eyed at skylines and bustling docks. America's scale shocked them. Towering cranes, endless rail lines, rows of trucks waiting to haul them inland. One officer who had expected to see a backward, depression-haunted country wrote later, "It was as if we had landed on another planet. There was so much steel, so many machines, so much life." From there, trains whisked the captives deep into the heartland. They pressed faces to windows as forests gave way to plains, as towns with neon diners and gasoline pumps flashed past. Instead of angry mobs, they saw curious children waving. By autumn 1944, the United States was holding nearly 400,000 German prisoners in more than 500 camps, spread from Maine to California. Some were massive complexes near army bases. Others were small branch camps set up near farms or canneries. The Texas camps, Camp Swift, Camp Hearn, Camp Huntsville, were among the largest. Here men like Muller found themselves fenced, but not brutalized. They were fingerprinted and photographed, issued denim uniforms, stenciled PW, then shown to long wooden barracks with pot-belly stoves. Medical officers vaccinated them, checked their teeth, even issued glasses. They had braced for cruelty. Instead, they got rules, routine, and enough calories to shock bodies used to wartime Europe. Daily life soon settled into an odd rhythm. Reveille came early. Squads formed for head count, while guards lounged with rifles, slung casually, not menacing, just procedure. Work detachments left in trucks or on foot. Some went to sawmills and cut timber. Others harvested cotton, peanuts, or sugar beets for local farmers short of labor. For their efforts, they earned script-like coupons redeemable at the camp canteen, soap, tobacco, paper, even small luxuries like coffee or chocolate when available. There were classrooms where prisoners taught languages and math, orchestras that played Beethoven and Schubert, even a camp newspaper mimeographed in German. At night, barracks buzzed with card games and whispered arguments about Hitler and the war's course. Still, fear lingered. The men were thousands of miles from home, unsure of their fate. And propaganda back in Germany said nothing about humane captivity. They wrote careful letters, censored but allowed to reassure families. "I am alive and well," many began, marveling privately that such a message was true. Then came November, and with it hints of something extraordinary. Guards talked quietly. Trucks arrived with unusual deliveries: sacks of potatoes, barrels of cranberries, crates marked turkey, keep chilled. American officers held briefings about holiday arrangements. Few Germans understood the meaning. Erntedank, some guessed the German harvest festival, but Thanksgiving was alien to them. A uniquely American blend of harvest, ritual, and national myth. Among the guards was Sergeant Bill Carter, a Kansas farm boy turned MP. He and others debated whether enemy aliens deserved holiday cheer. Carter wrote in his diary that month, "They're just men, hungry, far from home. We'll feed them like men." The War Department allowed generous rations. Local farmers volunteered to donate birds. Soon, camp mess halls smelled of sage and roasting meat, of bread and pumpkin pies cooling on windowsills. For the Americans, it was natural. Why shouldn't a holiday of gratitude include even captives? For the Germans, it was incomprehensible. Muller remembered the morning before Thanksgiving vividly. Frost glittered on the compound. The guards seemed unusually busy, carrying crates into the mess. Through the windows came smells that made stomachs growl. "Butter? I swear I smell butter," whispered a man from Bremen. Rumors raced. Maybe a visiting general. Maybe Red Cross inspectors. But nothing prepared them for what followed. That is where our story truly begins. Not with guns or tanks, but with ovens heating in a Texas camp kitchen, with turkeys basted in fat by cooks who just weeks earlier might have faced these same men in battle. A holiday that most Americans took for granted would become, for these prisoners, an unforgettable turning point. The days leading up to Thanksgiving passed with an undercurrent the Germans could not quite name. Life in the camp was predictable to the point of dullness. That predictability itself had become part of survival. Each morning the prisoners lined up in neat rows for muster, boots crunching frost or dust, depending on the weather. They wore the same denim jackets with POWs stenciled across the back, the same cotton caps. Guards checked their names against lists, counted again, sometimes teasing, sometimes stone-faced. Then trucks rumbled out with work detachments. Muller often rode out to nearby cotton fields, where he worked alongside local laborers. The pay was laughable, but the freedom riding beyond the wire. Seeing the Texas sky without guard towers always in view was priceless. Farmers would sometimes pass the men canteens of water or even an apple. One old rancher surprised them by speaking German, learned from grandparents who had emigrated long ago. "Arbeit, ja, work, good," he said with a grin, slapping Muller on the shoulder. The young soldier nodded. Stunned out at night, the barracks buzzed with arguments about the war. News filtered in through Red Cross bulletins and smuggled clippings. Allied armies pushing across France. Bombs hammering German cities. The Eastern Front collapsing. Some prisoners still clung to hope, believing miracle weapons would turn the tide. Others, especially veterans from Africa and Sicily, quietly accepted the inevitable. But even among the most cynical, something about America gnawed at old certainties. They had been told this land was decadent, weak, chaotic. Instead, they found wealth, order, and a kind of casual confidence. They were alive, fed, even paid for their labor. They were allowed to form theater troupes, to carve wooden toys, to study English with donated textbooks. They wrote letters home, describing decent food and clean barracks letters that slipped past censors, because they contained no military secrets, only the astonishing truth that the enemy treated them better than expected. As November deepened, the camp subtly changed. The mess hall, usually drab, filled with new smells. More trucks came through the gates, escorted by MPs, but stacked with crates not marked as army rations. Muller glimpsed butter stenciled on one. Another carried sacks of flour. Cooks, normally indifferent, bustled with secretive energy. Some prisoners who worked in the kitchen returned whispering of mountains of potatoes, cranberries, and dozens no, hundreds of turkeys. "They're going to feed us like kings," one said. Others scoffed. Impossible. They wouldn't waste that on prisoners. But the rumors had weight. For days, Guards hummed with holiday talk, letters from home about families gathering, rail cars crowded with soldiers going on furlough. One MP, leaning on his rifle during a break, tried to explain Thanksgiving to curious captives. "It's family, food, giving thanks," he said awkwardly. "Doesn't matter who you are, even you guys." That simple phrase, "even you guys," circulated fast. Some Germans reacted with suspicion. "Propaganda," muttered an old sergeant. "They want to break our spirits, make us think they're merciful." But younger men felt something else, a cautious stirring of hope or confusion. Private Ernst Keller, captured in Normandy, wrote later that it was the first time he questioned everything he'd believed about Americans. "We were told they were barbarians," he recalled, "yet here they planned to feast for us." Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the camp command faced its own debates. Captain Robert Whitaker, who oversaw prisoner welfare, argued with supply officers about rations. Regulations allowed for decent food, but not extravagance. Yet Whitaker believed morale and discipline improved when prisoners were treated firmly but humanely. He'd served in North Africa, seen starving men surrender rather than fight on. He knew mercy could be a weapon to one that undermined enemy propaganda faster than any leaflet. In his log he noted, "Thanksgiving meal approved. Local farmers donating birds, pies from wives' clubs. Will invite prisoners to share in observance." Symbolic gesture. Strength comes from decency. The plan grew. Town grocers sent coffee, sugar, spices. Civic groups offered pies and cakes. Some guards volunteered to help cook. The camp's German prisoner committee, a group of elected men, allowed to manage. Minor affairs was told nothing, except that a special meal was coming, and they should prepare men to line up when called. The secrecy added to the mystique. One evening, smoke curled from the kitchen chimneys, long after dark. The scent drifted across the yard, rich and buttery, triggering memories of childhood feasts long lost to war. Inside the barracks, men argued, should they accept whatever came? Would it be shameful to enjoy a holiday of the enemy? Oberfeld Wibble Heinrich Brandt, once proud tank NCO, scoffed, "They want to humiliate us with charity." Yet even he couldn't stop sniffing the air when turkey aromas wafted in. Hunger has its own politics. Others worried about etiquette. Was it proper to celebrate a foreign feast while comrades died in Russia? Still, others especially, the younger ones, were secretly excited. They'd been hungry too long not to care. Then came the day before Thanksgiving. Work details were canceled. Instead, guards ordered a full camp cleanup. Barracks swept, boots polished, uniforms brushed. It felt like an inspection, but the tone was different, less tense, almost festive. Some guards smiled or made clumsy jokes in German. "Morgen, big eats." One MP laughed, patting his stomach. The rumor became reality. Tomorrow there would be a meal like none they had seen since capture, maybe since before the war. Thanksgiving morning dawned cold and bright. Frost silvered the barbed wire and the towers. A bugle sounded, and instead of marching to work, prisoners were told to assemble by company. Across the yard, the mess hall door stood wide, decorated with paper leaves and crude bannersum, likely drawn by American kids and donated. From inside rolled a smell so overwhelming it silenced the yard. Roasted turkeys by the dozen, bread, pie, coffee. The scent alone seemed to defy war. Sergeant Carter and his MPs guided the first group forward. No weapons aimed, no shouting, just quiet direction. Inside, long tables were set, not with tin mess trays, but with plates, cups, even tablecloths. Steam rose from mountains of mashed potatoes, slick with butter. Turkeys, browned and glistening, lined the counters. Bowls of cranberry sauce, gravy boats, stacks of pumpkin pies. For men who'd lived on thin soups and dark bread, the sight was unreal. Some froze, unsure whether to sit. A cook in white apron gestured impatiently, "Come on, eat," and laughter broke out. The ice cracked. For a few stunned minutes, silence ruled except for the scrape of chairs. Then forks clinked, spoons dipped, voices rose in disbelief. "It's real turkey," someone whispered. Another man laughed out loud, almost giddy. Even hardened NCOs looked shaken. Muller sat staring at his plate-thick slices of meat, potatoes swimming in butter, a wedge of pie dusted with cinnamon. He thought of his mother's table before the war, of lean years under rationing, of frost-bitten nights in Africa with nothing but hard biscuit. Tears stung his eyes. He would write later, "In that moment, America stopped being a monster. It became a place where we were treated as men." The guards moved among the tables, refilling coffee, joking, answering shy questions. Some prisoners practiced halting English. "Thank you. Very good." Much food. Others sat in quiet shock, struggling to reconcile this abundance with the image of America they'd been taught. There was no propaganda officer lecturing, no leaflets about democracy, just food, warmth, and unforced kindness after the meal. The camp commander rose and, through an interpreter, explained Thanksgiving's meaning: a day to give thanks for survival, for home, even for peace yet to come. He spoke of respecting courage, even in the enemy, and of hoping that one day these men would return home to rebuild rather than destroy. The interpreter hesitated at one phrase, then translated anyway. "Today, you are far from home, but you are safe. We treat you as we hope our own would be treated." Some prisoners could not meet his eyes. The impact rippled beyond the dining hall. Letters written that night, carefully worded to pass censors, described the meal in astonished tones. "We ate better than officers," one young man told his parents. "Turkeys, cakes, even coffee without chicory. The Americans are strange. They fight hard, but are not cruel." Another wrote to a fiancé, "Do not believe what they tell you. They are not devils. Today, they fed us like family." These words traveled back across the Atlantic, filtered through censors, but still carrying truth. Allied intelligence quietly encouraged it. They knew each letter was a tiny pinprick deflating Nazi propaganda. A German soldier's family who heard that Americans served turkey to captives might doubt the regime's tales of brutal enemies. Within the camp, the event lingered. For days, men spoke of little else. Hardened sergeants admitted the food was better than any field ration they'd had since 1939. Younger prisoners asked guards about recipes, about why Americans celebrated such a day. Some even carved small wooden turkeys or painted scenes of the feast. One barracks created a makeshift sign reading, "Danke, thank you," which guards left hanging. Yet the holiday's effect went deeper than gratitude. It cracked the armor of indoctrination. Men raised to think of enemies as subhuman now saw generosity where they expected vengeance. For some, it was the first step in reshaping beliefs that would matter long after the war. Outside the fence, locals debated the wisdom of kindness. Some thought it too soft. Others saw it as proof of America's moral strength. A local newspaper covered the meal cautiously, noting only that prisoners were provided holiday rations in accordance with Geneva Convention. But guards and farmers told the fuller story quietly. "We gave them turkey, just like our boys overseas." The kitchen, meanwhile, became legend. Cooks bragged about feeding thousands, telling of ovens glowing day and night, of exhausted soldiers peeling mountains of potatoes, of pies cooled in every spare corner. Some later said it was the proudest thing they did during the war. For the prisoners, the lesson was seared deep. War had taken everything uniform, homeland illusions. Yet here, in a foreign land, the enemy offered not just safety, but dignity. Muller would remember it for decades, telling his grandchildren, "The Americans, they gave us turkey when they didn't have to." That's when I knew the war was lost not by bombs, but by spirit. The first weeks of November brought the kind of crisp air that carried wood smoke and the smell of tilled fields. In Camp Algona, the prisoners worked with quiet routine, repairing fences, stacking wood, sweeping the long barracks where pot-bellied stoves clanked and hissed. At dawn, frost silvered the ground, and boots left dark trails across the parade yard. Some of the guards walked slower now, speaking a little more with the men they oversaw. The war was still raging far away. Alcan had just fallen. The Bulge still months ahead, but here in Iowa, winter came first. One cold morning, a sergeant named Bill Handerhand entered the barracks with a clipboard and a grin that looked mischievous. "Got a detail for tomorrow," he said in simple, accented German. "Volunteers for farm work. Good pay, big dinner." The room stilled. Farm work wasn't unusual. Prisoners had been sent out all summer to pick corn and sugar beets. But big dinner, that was something new. The interpreter explained. Some local farmers had asked for help with final harvest and fence repairs before the snow. They'd feed whoever came. One of the older Germans, a former schoolteacher from Hamburg, raised an eyebrow and said quietly, "Feed us, what? Turnips?" But no one laughed. By the next morning, a truck rumbled to the gate, its flatbed covered with straw bales to sit on. 15 men clambered aboard, wearing thick Army-issue coats, stamped PW in huge black letters. Their breath made small clouds in the dawn as the truck rolled out past the camp's barbed wire and watchtowers into the pale countryside. Hans Keller, a wiry, dark-haired mechanic from Cologne, watched the prairie unfold and felt a jolt of freedom he hadn't known since Tunisia. The road curved past red barns and white houses, fields of corn stubble stretching to the horizon. There were no sirens, no Gestapo, no bombers overhead, only fences, silos, and an endless sky. The truck stopped at a family farm, where a tall man in overalls and a feed cap waited beside a windmill. "Morning," he said simply. Then, in careful German, "Willkommen." "We work, then eat." The men jumped down. Someone sniffed the air wood smoke. "Hey," the faint sweet scent of apples. They followed the farmer to a barn stacked with tools, hammers, saws, spools of wire. Hans took a post-hole digger. Karl from Leipzig swung an axe with easy skill. The work began. Through the morning, the Americans' reserve melted. The farmer's teenage son brought hot coffee in tin mugs and thick bread with apple butter. One of the prisoners tried a joke about Prussian efficiency, and the boy laughed. Another told him, haltingly, about working on his father's farm near Bremen before the draft. The boy's mother came out with a tray of steaming mugs. Her face was stern at first, but as she watched these supposed enemies tamp fence posts into the hard Iowa ground, her expression softened. "Danke," she said shyly, and the men straightened. Startled, after hours of mending fences and clearing brush, the Americans called it a day. The sun was low, and the air smelled of burning leaves. The farmer's wife beckoned them toward the big white farmhouse. Inside, the warmth hit like a wave. Wood floors, braided rugs, the scent of roasting turkey, something spiced and sweet in the oven. The POWs hesitated at the threshold, unsure if they were really invited past the door. "Come on in," the farmer said. "Shoes off." They looked at each other, then stepped inside. The kitchen and dining room were crowded with platters, turkey glistening golden brown, bowls of mashed potatoes swimming in butter, gravy boats steaming baskets of fresh rolls, cranberries, pies, apple, pumpkin, pecan. The Germans froze. For months they'd eaten thin soup, black bread, canned meat. This was impossible abundance. Hans whispered, "Mein Gott," and for once nobody shushed him. They sat awkwardly, eyes darting to the guards who had come along but seemed relaxed, laughing with the farmers as if everyone were just neighbors. The interpreter raised a glass of cider and said in German, "Thanksgiving." He struggled to explain the holiday. Not a religious feast, but a day to gather. Give thanks. Share what you have. Share, he repeated, looking around. Americans share? Conversation began in halting bursts. The teenage boy asked about Germany before the war. One prisoner described fishing on the Rhine as a boy. Another, who'd been a baker in Dresden, asked how to make pumpkin pie. They didn't have pumpkins back home. The farmer's wife poured coffee and pressed warm rolls into calloused hands. Someone said softly, "I have not eaten like this since my mother's table." Outside, snow flurries drifted down. Inside, the room glowed with lamplight and wood heat. By dessert, men who hadn't smiled in years were laughing at a farmer's story about a runaway cow. One older POW wiped his eyes quietly. Another whispered to Hans, "They think we are human." When it was time to leave, the farmer's wife wrapped leftover pie and tucked it into the men's coats. The teenage boy handed Hans a pair of wool gloves. At the truck, the farmer shook each man's hand. "Work good," he said simply. "Eat good, go home someday." No speeches, no politics, just dignity. On the drive back, the prisoners were silent at first. Then voices rose softly in the dark. A Christmas hymn, the tune fragile but warm. Guards listened without interruption. Hans stared out at the snowy fields and felt a confusing swell in his chest. Gratitude, shame, hope. For months, Allied propaganda had painted Americans as crude, vengeful. Nazi officers had promised their soldiers they'd be starved and beaten in captivity. But here he was, belly full of turkey and pie, new gloves on his hands, the memory of a woman's shy smile tucked somewhere behind his ribs. He wondered what his mother would say if she could see him tonight. Word of the Thanksgiving dinner rippled through Camp Algona like electricity. Men who'd been hardened and withdrawn began volunteering for farm work, not for pay, but for a taste of dignity and warmth. Letters home, carefully censored but still vivid, spoke of kindness unexpected and meals unimaginable. German censors would never see them, but the words still gave hope. I ate with an American family. They treated us as men, not enemies. By December, the camp's mood had shifted. Fights dwindled. Guards noticed fewer escape plans scratched into bunk wood. Even officers, hardened by Afrika Korps service, looked thoughtful. When a Red Cross inspector visited, prisoners crowded around, asking if Americans always treated captives this way. He shrugged. Here, yes. For the farmers, too, something changed. At first, some neighbors had grumbled about feeding the enemy. But those who'd sat across from thin young men with polite manners and faraway eyes began writing letters to editors, telling of hard work done well, of gratitude shown in quiet, unguarded ways. One Iowa newspaper ran a Thanksgiving piece titled simply, "Our Hired Hands from Germany," describing not prisoners, but men. Winter deepened. Snow packed the camp yard, but warmth lingered from that meal in the farmers' kitchens, in the barracks where men whispered of home, in the letters that would someday tell children and grandchildren how an enemy's kindness began with a shared table. The winter months that followed Thanksgiving settled over the camp with a quiet that felt almost unnatural to men who'd spent years in artillery barrages, tank engines, and the crash of bombs. At night, the Iowa wind howled through the barbed wire fences, rattling tin roofs. But inside the barracks, there was talk, low, warm, sometimes hesitant. Stories traded over stoves about childhood rivers and lost fathers, about cities left behind in smoke. The Thanksgiving meal had cracked something open, an unspoken realization that the world beyond the wire wasn't filled with monsters. The American guards sensed the change too. Patrols felt easier, discipline sharper, but without the same edge of hostility. Sergeant Hanrahan, the same one who had first called for volunteers, started greeting men by name, even joking with a few about their football. He corrected himself, earning shy grins. At night, he lingered by the gate, cigarette glowing in the dark, listening to the distant hum of trains carrying grain east and war west. Some of the prisoners started asking about those trains. Where were the goods going? Would they help families starving back in Europe? Hanrahan couldn't answer, but he didn't mind the questions. When Christmas approached, the farmers who'd hosted the first Thanksgiving quietly asked if the camp would allow work crews again. They needed help clearing timber and hauling hay before the deep freeze. But there was more behind the invitation, a wish to extend the strange peace of that November day. The commandant hesitated. Fraternization was technically discouraged. But the war felt far away now, and the requests kept coming. In the end, practical needs overruled paperwork. Crews would go. One icy morning, trucks rumbled through the snowy gate again, this time with evergreen wreaths tied to their grills. The men on the flatbeds clutched borrowed mittens, hats pulled low. They were met at each farm not just with tools, but with small, quiet gestures, mugs of coffee, tin cups of hot cider, a slice of bread with homemade jam. They worked hard, sawing limbs, stacking wood, clearing drifts that could trap livestock. And when the chores were done, they were again invited inside. It wasn't Thanksgiving now, but Advent, and the homes glowed with lanterns and pine boughs. Some farmers played scratchy carols on radios. Others hummed hymns familiar in both German and English. A few of the prisoners, once proud soldiers of the Reich, found themselves singing to voices trembling but steady, still, Nahat mingling with silent night. Tears came easily, and no one mocked them. One farmhouse in particular, the Jensen place, became almost legendary. Mrs. Jensen, a strong-handed woman with bright eyes, had baked stolen from a recipe sent years before by her German-born grandmother. When the POWs saw it, sugared and fragrant. They stared, as if at a relic from home. She broke the loaf and handed it out, piece by piece. To peace, she said softly. Hans Keller felt something inside him shift again. He hadn't eaten, stolen, since his mother's last Christmas before the war. After the holiday trips, the Red Cross inspector returned, this time surprised to find the men more hopeful than any camp he'd seen. They think maybe the future will not be all barbed wire, he wrote. Letters home from the Americans reflected the same. Never thought I'd shake hands with Nazis and feel anything but hate. One farmer told his local paper, but these are just boys. Another wrote, we lost sons to this war, but maybe feeding these ones keeps some other son alive somewhere. Spring came slowly. Snow melted to mud, then to grass. Farm crews became routine, nearly invisible. What had begun as a guarded experiment turned into quiet cooperation. The POWs learned to mend tractors, build barns, even deliver calves. Farmers learned bits of German, enough to praise a job well done or ask about a man's hometown. Sometimes they swapped songs or showed photographs. A baby born while its father fought in Tunisia. A sweetheart back in Dresden. A farmhouse wedding in Nebraska. Humanity seeped in where ideology had been. Hans, who had once repaired Luftwaffe vehicles, spent long days at the Bennett's dairy barn fixing milking machines. He earned extra cigarettes, but more than that, earned trust. When one machine jammed before dawn milking, Mr. Bennett pounded on his quarters and led him out to the barn in the dark. Need your hands, he said simply, handing him a wrench. They worked side by side, steam rising from the cows, until the line clattered back to life. Afterward, Bennett poured him black coffee and slapped his shoulder. Good man. The words stayed with Hans for weeks. By late summer 1945, word filtered through the camp. The war in Europe was over. Germany had surrendered. Some men dropped to benches and wept silently. Others stared blankly, unsure if surrender meant safety or shame. The Americans didn't gloat. Guards passed the news with quiet respect. Farmers brought newspapers, some just photographs. Berlin in ruins. The Reichstag a shell. There were no cheers. Only the sound of boots on gravel and men grappling with a war's end. Far from home, the harvest that followed was enormous. Wheat heavy, corn thick. Once again, farmers asked for help, and once again, the trucks rolled out. But this time, there was something different. Less fear, more fellowship. No one worried much about escape now. The POWs rode without armed escort beyond a token guard. At supper tables, they weren't stared at but welcomed. One farmer, known for his reserve, even toasted the end of the war with a mug of beer saved for threshing crews. Peace, he said. The men murmured freedom. Thanksgiving of 1945 came with quiet certainty. At farms across Iowa, German prisoners sat once more at long tables, this time without the awkward silence. They carved turkey, passed potatoes, laughed with children. Many brought small handmade gifts, carved toys, woven straw trivets, a pair of mittens knitted from prison camp wool. Farmers' wives, smiling, accepted them with tears. Hans wrote a final letter before repatriation in early '46. The world told me. America was cruel, but I worked their land, and they fed me. They saw me when I could not see myself anymore. When I go home, I will tell my son that the enemy gave me bread. He tucked it into his kit to mail once free, when the last trucks carried them back to Algona before departure. Farmers lined the roads, waving. Guards shook hands with men they had once watched down rifle barrels. There were few words. The moment itself said enough. The prisoners left Iowa with bellies fed and something else proof. That war's hate could break. The memory lasted long after the fences came down. Children who had shared pie with enemy soldiers grew up remembering quiet German voices, singing Christmas songs in their living rooms. Old men who had once marched, captured enemies, now recalled handshakes and shared work. And for the Germans, men who had been taught to see the world through iron crosshairs, the image of an American farmhouse glowing warm on a freezing Thanksgiving remained a private miracle.